will now pass this to my colleague Marie, who will talk more about mediated learning experiences and those three main ideas just shared by Dr. Liz Pena: child responsivity, transfer, and examiner effort.
Thank you, Lisa. We have these great resources through the ASHA website, and as you've seen that this video from Liz Pena is on YouTube. There are several videos from her on dynamic assessment, and we sent one in advance, but there are others on YouTube as well as the ASHA website, pointing us to a lot of the work that she's done, a lot of the research, and really breaking down what the mediated learning experience is, what it consists of, and what these elements of child modifiability are. So as she said, we are looking at the student responsivity to you. It is, as Andrea said, a dynamic interaction. It's all about the interaction between the clinician and the child. So we're looking for how the student is responding to you, how they're responding to the teaching that you're giving, and are they paying attention? Are they trying to take these skills to a different level where they could actually transfer them to another task, which is the next piece of measuring modifiability. This is giving us an idea of the child's ability to learn, which Lisa has mentioned. We're looking at learning potential, the child's ability to modify their response to the task that's in front of them. And as Andrea mentioned, we start out with something static, maybe a norm reference test, and then we give them this opportunity to really interact in the zone of proximal development with a clinician and elevate that experience to another level. And we can see how much effort it takes on our part as clinicians to make that happen, to elicit the learning from the child and really get what we can out of them during this dynamic interaction. So the components of the MLE are also nicely laid out in the ASHA website, as well as a video from Liz Pena where she takes you through one of her research protocols where they introduced an activity with intentionality. They stated the goal. What are they trying to do? And giving the child an idea of what the purpose of the activity is. So this is again where we're kind of pulling back the curtain from the static norm referenced assessment. We're giving the child a chance to really figure out what is the purpose of the task that we've asked them to do. So in her case, she said to the children, they were preschoolers, we're going to play with some toys and books, and we're going to think about and say special names. And she was looking at their word learning ability. So how were they able to acquire new vocabulary? What are we talking about? And then she asked the child to repeat it. The focus is special names. So again, it's dynamic, it's back and forth. How do special names help us? They help us know what we're both talking about. So the child is very involved in the process as well as the clinician. And then they move on to transcend that interaction in the moment of the MLE to say, so how does this apply to real life? If I call you by an incorrect name, so maybe you could use the child's brother's name or sister's name, would you answer me? Maybe a classmate's name? No, you wouldn't answer me in those situations because names are important. We need to use the specific name that names a person or an item. So you give them this example in real life and help them really think about how to apply this to situations that they would be in themselves. And again, that's taking them outside of the testing context or this kind of artificial context that we create when we're doing evaluations. Then the clinician says, so we're going to play gas station with the cars first, then we're going to read a book about transportation. What are we doing first? Have the child respond, playing with the gas station. Here are some cars, let's play. What do we need? What should we do? So they have the play interaction. Do you remember what we're talking about today? And again, going back to the goal. to make sure that they are still remembering, we're talking about learning special names, and we need to use special names for the items that we're naming. There are some very strange characters that show up on this slide that you probably have noticed by now. Those came directly off the ASHA website, but you get an idea of the questions that you would ask. And then in the competence part of the MLE, you would have the child develop a plan for thinking how would they apply special names to other contexts so that they can really use the skill and take it into that transfer opportunity with other either test items or other experiences that they have. To close the session, you would say you worked really hard today. Do you remember what we were working on? Special names. At first you didn't use special names, but we worked on that. And now you know that those are important. You were able to name, and then you can name some of the items in your activity, the gas station, the types of cars, and then you can say that they also were able to follow the directions and complete the tasks successfully. So Liz Pena really takes us through step by step what these components of the MLE are, why they're important, and those 4 components of intentionality, meaning, transcendence, and competence are very consistent across the research on dynamic assessment. We really need these elements to be present in the mediated learning. We're going to come again at the concept of dynamic assessment from the KWL. What do we know? What do we want to know? And what have we learned? Because as clinicians, you might have even felt like that interaction between the clinician and the child sounded like therapy. It doesn't necessarily have to be within a testing or evaluation context. So we do know as clinicians how to elicit this kind of interaction with a child in therapy. We know how to do some trial therapy, see if they can perform a skill, use stimulability probes for sounds. Graduated prompting is what we're doing all the time when we use different levels of cueing, using repetitions, giving choices. In the therapy context, this is what we're doing on a daily basis. So as Lisa said, it's something that we're familiar with, and now we're applying it to the evaluation process. We need to be able to document it within the evaluation, and that's what makes it part of the evaluation and makes it a dynamic assessment, completing it and documenting it. So what we want to know is how to get those targets of dynamic assessment. What is the teaching going to look like? And I've gone through a script with you of the kind of interaction that we get in the mediated learning experience. How are we going to document that? How are we going to actually document the modifiability of the child? And then how will we use the results? So one of the big concepts, again, of dynamic assessment that you're probably familiar with is the test, teach, retest. We do some kind of pre-test. We need to establish a baseline of skills. This could come from a formal test. It could come from something informal that you do, something criterion referenced. But we're always, as clinicians, looking for what we are needing to fix, or what was the referring concern that brought the child to us in the first place. What is the deficit, or what's the error, or what's the mistake that needs to be addressed? And when we hone in on one of those in the pretest to establish a baseline, that's where the test component of dynamic assessment gives us our starting point. And we're going to take all of our clinical skills and put them into the teaching dynamic interaction through the mediated learning experience. We use the scaffolding principles of the zone of proximal development to approach the target. Where's the child with this particular skill, and where is the learner in the need for cueing and need for support in order to perform the skill. I've gone over these 4 components already, but I'd like to give you an example to show how you can use this with a student and One student that I have used this with very recently wasn't in a context of evaluation, but it had that principle of the MLE within our teaching interaction as part of therapy. The child actually is an articulation needs student. So we've been working on primarily the R sound, and the student has a language of Hmong at home. Although he doesn't speak the language, he has that influence and it's part of his home life and culture. So he's exposed to Hmong, which doesn't always include final consonants as grammatical markers the way we do in English. When he was reading something to me and I was listening for his R sound, I noticed him dropping off a lot of S's in his reading. And I thought, you know, this student is doing great on his R's. I really want to talk to his mother and his teachers about dismissal, but I know that they're going to say to me, well, we don't hear him pronouncing all the sounds at the ends of words. And because I could hear some S's and not others, you know, I knew this wasn't a consistent articulation pattern. There wasn't a final S deletion that was happening in every context, and the S's were being articulated properly in other contexts. So I said to the student, you know, I'm listening to you read and I'm hearing you do really well on the R sounds, but I'm noticing that you're only pronouncing some of the S's. So you're using them in the middle of the words, but not always at the end of words. And I wonder if, you know, we could reread this, because it's going to be really important for your teachers to hear all those S's as you're reading so that they know what's happening in this passage. And that gives him the intentionality piece. I want him to understand why I'm asking him to go back and reread it. I don't just say, could you read that again, and then make my notes. It's also giving the meaning piece. This is important for your teachers, and that transcends the task that we're doing there. We're moving it into the reality of the classroom. And I can even give him specifics about the possessive S. I don't know who that item belongs to if I don't hear an S at the end of the word that marks possession. I didn't want to get too much into the grammar of it, but transcending to the classroom application was something that I knew would be relevant for the student. He does want to do well with his teachers, and that also gives us an opportunity to look at the transfer of the skill. Could he take it from the therapy room back to the classroom, which we also think of as generalization. So again, a lot of these principles between therapy and evaluation are consistent. So I had him reread the passage, and with his knowledge that that was important for me to hear those S's, he did a much more consistent job of including them all at the ends of words. And I was able to tell him that he did a great job and he understood what I asked him to do by demonstrating it. One other note I could make on that is that, you know, when we're talking about difference versus disability, I did mention that he has multiple languages in his home. You know, we really want the MLE to show us, you know, is that something that the child can change? Is it something that they maybe haven't been exposed to? But when I tell them, hey, for English, this is important, or hey, for your teachers, this is important, whatever the reason is, you know, we're looking during the MLE to see how they respond to that. How much effort does it take on my part? He's probably heard that before. And all of this is very valuable information about the student as an individual and their learning potential. So we're not just looking to see what can you do as a snapshot of previously acquired skills. We're looking to see what can you do with my assistance in that zone of proximal development. Some of the types of cues that we would offer, you're familiar with, you know, either requesting if a student is maybe brought to you saying a sound incorrectly, you ask them to repeat. Can they improve? You know, lots of times people will say, in fact, I had a client this past semester and his mom said, he can't say this sound. And then he said it right in front of her. So, you know, just asking them to repeat sometimes makes a difference. And when we are given referring concerns and we say, well, did anyone try to see if they could do that? You know, that's kind of one of the things we're talking about, because did anyone attempt any of these scaffolding skills that we're so familiar with in therapy? Did they give them a model? Did they give them 2 answer choices? It's not to say that they will be successful immediately with these, but we're trying to see what works. We might have to go to the maximum level where we say, I'm just going to tell you the answer and have you repeat it. But all of these things give us very valuable information about the child as a learner. And when we go back to retest them, we've got our baseline, and what we might be doing is giving another set of items that are kind of similar to the baseline. If we did maybe, let's say you take something like the SLAP, something criterion referenced, where you have to name, 10 household items. If you have the child as a baseline, try to name 5 and see how they do. You might go back and give another 5 to see how they do. So then that would be consistent with Liz Pena's example of working on learning vocabulary, learning specific names or special names. You could also go back and use your formal test to see if there has been improvement. So when a child is on the self-following directions, sometimes they really aren't understanding what's going on and they're doing poorly on the subtest, and you can see that if you could just give them a little bit more information, if you could break that from that standardization and get away from the static nature of that test, maybe they would do better. And so you could use that as a baseline and then perform an MLE or engage in an MLE with the child, and then go back and retest and see how do they improve on a subtest from a formal measure. The one thing is that you're not going to change scores. You're not going to say, oh, that I'm going to use that new score. That's a better score. It's more accurate. You still need to report what happens with the standardized use of the test. Then you can document a dynamic interaction with the child and then talk about how they performed afterwards. So the dynamic assessment can fit right into the other testing that you're doing. And my next example is also going to talk about reevaluations, because we often are reevaluating children and we have the chance to work with them in therapy as well. So during that retest opportunity, that's when you really see if there's been a transfer of skills and what level of independence the child can reach. In this example, a student is having difficulty following 2-step directions. So I already knew this about the student from a variety of sources, actually, not just one test, because he was on my caseload. I knew that in the classroom he wasn't following directions, and I knew that in speech therapy he wasn't following directions, and I knew that on formal testing he wasn't following directions very well. So I had plenty of places to get a baseline for his ability to follow 2-step directions. This example is looking at the modifiability of the child. So there's so much happening within an MLE. We have all these components that we're presenting, and then we have the components that we're measuring from the child, that I'm just focusing on the modifiability in this example. I asked him to take photos of different toys that he had in his home. This is during virtual learning, and tell me about the toys. So of course, as an SLP, listening to him talk about the toys is more important than seeing the photos of the toys. But for him, it was more fun to take photos of his toys. And he only followed part of the first step of the directions. Indicated to me that he knew what he needed to do, but only took one photo and then didn't even talk about playing with that toy. He talked about playing with a friend. So he really was not responding at all to this task. I went back in another interaction with him, talked about how he didn't follow the directions, used some of those scaffolding skills. So you're not seeing the intentionality and all of the MLE in here. As I said, this is more to look at how you're measuring the modifiability. But I did use scaffolding. I did consider what different types of skills he might need. Did he need to see a model from a peer? Did he need repetition? He still didn't perform the task. So I could see, this is my second time giving him the same request, and he's going to need more assistance to be successful. So I had to put a lot of effort into that. And that's part of his modifiability. I'm not getting him to change easily. And as Liz Pena mentioned in the video, this is very subjective. I'm documenting it. I'm saying this is what happened, but it's anecdotal. And that can be part of documenting the dynamic assessment. What did it sound like? What did you do? What were the strategies that you used to try to help the child be successful? And then what effect did it have, and what effect did it have on you as a clinician too? So you're reporting qualitatively that this is how successful the child was, and this is how much it took from you to make that happen. There are several protocols that are available free online, and they break down the components of the MLE. We have a difference between an approach and instruments. These would be instruments of dynamic assessment where you can look at them kind of step by step and say, oh, here's where I can mark how responsive the child was. Here's where I can mark if I talked about intentionality or addressed transcendence. So these protocols would be instruments for helping you to work on that documentation so that you would know how to report it. The example from Liz Pena, where there's a whole script that you can follow and the components of looking at the modifiability and the MLE, that's the approach. So it's a very general approach to dynamic assessment that we're all basically going to use, that's going to have the MLE and the child modifiability. And then you can look at these protocols for examples of instruments where you can actually document it to have it ready for your report writing. So what we've learned through this experience is how quickly the child learns. Can we get them to perform better on a retest? And if you're within a 60-day timeline, you're going to have restrictions on how quickly you go from pre-test to post-test. If you're in a reevaluation situation, you might use therapy data, but you'll be gathering that information on how quickly the child learns, how easily they learn, what types of cues and support are you giving, and whether the child can transfer the skill to a new task. So did they demonstrate learning and respond differently when we gave them the opportunity? So we're maximizing learner potential and really giving the child their best opportunity to show us what they can do. As Lisa mentioned, this is what's going to inform our clinical judgment. We're using our observations, our subjective experiences, all that anecdotal data is valuable. This is what happened when I did this. This is what happened when I gave the child the opportunity to say that. So that's where we get our clinical judgment from, and that's what's going to inform our decision-making when we're looking at eligibility criteria. So it is still a subjective, more informal process, and we need to consider this in the context of the entire evaluation. We have case history information. We have observations from teachers and parents. We have criterion referenced and standardized test measures. Our clinical judgment is a component that goes into our decision-making. We want this as a dynamic interaction that can add to the information we've gained through these other static measures so that we can then use our clinical judgment to make good decisions for children.